There we go. Should be recording now. So our agenda is split into 6 parts. It is the first one is the icebreaker. The second one is intro to intersectionality. The third one is classism. The fourth one is racism. The fifth one is sexism, and the sixth one is the 3 intersections and also comments. To begin, we're going to do an icebreaker. What is your biggest pet peeve? For example, is being yelled at. I absolutely hate it, and I'll turn into a Karen.
For me personally, I don't like people who spit on the sidewalk. It like pisses me off. I do not like it. I think it's very unhygienic. But yeah, if anyone wants to share in the comments or turn their mic on, that can be great too.
Okay. So the definition of intersectionality. It's the interconnected forms of identity and social categorization that causes discrimination towards an individual or group who fits into these categories. These could include classism, racism, sexism. It could also be about religion, language, history, heritage, so much more. Now, list 3 identities you identify with. For example, I identify as a working class, an immigrant, and a student.
I personally identify as a student, an immigrant, and a community organizer. And now, if anyone wants to share their identities in the chat, that would be great, so we can get to know each other a little better. Okay, so someone said woman, Filipino, immigrant, awesome. Someone else said immigrant, organizer, and teacher. That's great. Thank you for sharing your identities. It's, I think, necessary sometimes so we can like connect with each other better and get to know each other. I know that a lot of us have some identities in common, for example, being an immigrant, which is great because we can connect on another level through that.
Now, what is classism? Classism is a prejudice against someone's or a group's belonging to a social class. Classism tends to be widespread in the elites against the lower classes. It has been in society since the advent of hierarchy and inequality from the birth of agriculture. As you can see, most classes tend to be part of the billionaire class, the elites, the wealthy, and they kind of look down upon regular people like us. The history of classism. There's been land grabs, Native Americans that were dominated by the elites. They used the American army, which was overwhelmingly poor, to get these Native American lands and for their own benefit. Slavery was used as an oppressive system that abused unfree blacks for the benefit of the wealthy from the South and the North. As you can see, all these slaves, they were harvesting like cotton, tobacco, a lot of these products, and they were just used in the South where there were the Southern elites. No, they also send those products to industrialists and robber barons to the North. So it was an oppressive system that the entirety of the United States used. As you can also see, the Trail of Tears, Native Americans were sold, their lands was stolen. They were sent to unfertile lands that didn't have a lot of productivity. They were poor. A lot of them starved, and poor people didn't take these lands. Poor whites didn't take them. It was usually the rich who was taking more land. And to continue, tenant farming, sharecropping, and farm mortgages were tools used by the powerful to dominate the poor whites, blacks, etc. It's kind of like debt right now. Let's say you owe a wealthy person $2,000. What they will do is they will make you work 20, 30, like 12, 15 hours a day so you can pay back that debt, but they have like such high interest rates you can never could. And that's what they were doing. Immigrant labor was also used by the robber barons for cheap labor. They use coercion and imitation for their wealth. They pressured these immigrants to work 12, 13, 14 hours, and they threatened them that they were going to cut their wages, dock their wages, or deport them back to their home country. Anti-communist rhetoric was used to weaken unions during the 50s, 60s, and 70s that provided a boom for the working and middle classes. The elites, they were very against unions because it provided more political and economic power to regular middle and working class people. The rise of the Reagan era also led to the implementation of policies that cut taxes for the rich, lower wages, and busted unions that damaged the power of the middle class and working class while bolstering the elites. Uh, there's trickle side economics, supply side economics, all that just focus on cutting taxes and regulations for the wealthy, but he increased taxes for the middle and working class. So he was very classist. International and global trade deals, for example, NAFTA and TPP, overwhelmingly benefited corporations and the rich while damaging the working and middle class. Many of the jobs that were in the Midwest that tended to be unionized, tended to be highly paid, highly regulated. They were offshored and offshore to other countries that didn't have as many regulations and for the benefit of the wealthy and corporations. This caused deindustrialization and the rise of corporate power that led to poverty and reduced political power for the Native American. Like unions, at its peak, they used to be around 35% of the private workforce. Now they're only around 7%. So there was like a huge cutback on union and Native Americans' political power. Classism now.
Someone in the comments said anti-union sounds like some of the big tech companies today. And then someone also said, been seeing a lot about anti-union news about Amazon recently, which is great because that will bring us to our next point. As you just saw the immense history of classism and anti-unionism. And now we're gonna see how that affects us today.
Yeah. It actually perfectly leads into this slide. Most classism has become subtle as blatant hatred to a class is seen as less socially acceptable. So you'll never really see a wealthy person saying like, oh, these dirty, lazy workers, they're not as good as me. Like you won't see that anymore because everyone they realize like they'll get attacked for it. Now, to counteract that and to continue that classism, workplaces have now treated employees like robots and cogs in the machine instead of human beings. They quickly punish workers who don't fulfill an unrealistic quota. For example, according to the New York article by Noel Magster, titled Amazon Slammed for Denying Workers Were Forced to Pee in Bottles. Amazon truck drivers are forced to pee in bottles and even defecate in bags just to fulfill their product quota. And as the comment section stated too, they're very anti-union. Big tech is also very anti-union. They want to continue their dominance of the workforce. In mainstream media, many reporters look down on workers for being lazy and stupid. They argue that the conditions have been caused by their own doing. In reality, American workers are the most productive in history. According to a report by the Economic Policy Institute, productivity has increased by 253%, while pay has only risen by 115.6%. That's a 6 times difference since the 1970s. As you can see in this graph, prior to the 1970s, productivity and hourly compensation were pretty much matched. But after the 1970s and the rise of Reagan and Reaganomics, hourly compensation was stagnating while productivity was rapidly increasing. This caused companies and CEOs to nearly reap all the newly created wealth, while the working and middle classes have seen their pay stagnate or even fall in some occasions.
Now, in the comments, in the chat, someone is saying that sounds like an urban myth. I couldn't believe that's real, and the pay hasn't really changed since the 70s, and it's really real. And as we can see from the charts, thank you, Lise, for showing us that this has real consequences, and that classism isn't just something that's experienced at a microaggressive level, but it's experienced at an institutional level, as Lise just talked about. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yes. And yeah, pay hasn't risen at all. If you adjust it for inflation, it has actually fallen quite a little bit. So it's getting harder to live in the United States. Now here's a question. Who do you think is the best example of a classist? Like anyone you think. For me, it will probably be someone like Jeff Bezos. Like he talks about how he created all his wealth, and the workers, like, they're just being lazy, and there shouldn't be unions because he knows best. That's an example of a classist that who doesn't isn't a he doesn't directly say it, but he has like subtle languages and things he says and policy he does for his company that shows that he's a classist.
For me, if when I think of a classist, I think of a lot of those rich white influencers who like have gotten a lot of attention. For example, Lori Loughlin, I think her daughter, or Olivia, I forgot her name honestly, but that's an example of a classist because it really shows the amount of privilege and ignorance they have. And it shows that they just really don't care about poor people. They just care about themselves and their, you know, rich privilege problems.
So now, what is racism? Racism is discrimination of a person or a group based on their race, while upholding the belief that one's race is superior. This doesn't just involve whites against blacks. It also whites against Mexicans, whites against Asians. It can also involve Central Americans versus Southern Americans. It can involve Italians against Greeks. It can involve a wide spectrum of things. Race doesn't have a scientific basis, but it's a social construct. There's no biology, there's no DNA correlated with race. It's more of a social construct. Like, there's like physical differences, but those are just mostly your body adapting to the environment of where you're living. Racism is present everywhere on the globe due to tribalism of humanity. We're very tribal, and we kind of dehumanize other groups if we don't interact with them. The United States has an extensive history with racism, as you can see in the political cartoon. It shows the KKK. There's a big statue, and there's a couple of Black Americans there, and they're looking onto it because in the South there is a prevailing culture of God, like making like the Confederates and the KKK divine. It's not that the people in the South are evil or they're bad, but it's just part of their culture that they grew up in. History of racism. There's 10.7 million slaves that were transported from Africa to the Americas, and only 2.7 million of them survived. So around 8 million actually died during the travel. Slaves were forced in unpaid labor for more than 300 years for the benefit of the wealthy. Native Americans were also subjugated to slavery, and they were robbed of their lands because many Anglo-Saxon colonists and early Americans believed that they didn't have a right to the land, like it was a God-given right to the Anglo-Saxons. Natives were forced into educational camps that eliminated many of their languages and cultures. Native Americans were forced into unfertile and poor lands like Oklahoma. The Native Americans that were transported there, the people who organized that transportation, they didn't pay attention to any of the cultural and any of the cultural and societal divides between each tribe. They kind of just mixed it together, so it became a very like unstable, very hostile environment, similar to where in Africa, where American European division of lands caused a lot of ethnic cleansing, ethnic conflicts. Free Blacks and Native Americans were denied equal status in society and under the law compared to wealthy Anglo-Saxon whites. White immigrants, examples Irish, Italians, and Eastern Europeans, were subjugated to anti-immigration sentiment and racism. It wasn't just Blacks, Native Americans, Latinos. It also included many of these white Europeans who were looked down upon by Anglo-Saxon, French, Nordic ethnic groups. Only Anglo-Saxons, property-owning whites, were allowed to vote until the 1820s. After emancipation, Blacks were still subjugated to Jim Crow laws that blocked the rights to vote, to own property, on equal subject under the law. So while the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment was supposed to provide equal protections towards Blacks and other racial groups, instead, Jim Crow was implemented to limit the right to vote. So they used poll taxes, they used intimidation. The KKK was around to block Black voters from voting, many stuff like that. Non-Anglo-Saxon whites and other minorities were blocked from participating in American elections through barriers such as poll taxes, property requirements, which are still around in some occasions, and their grandfather clauses. White-only unions and white-only primaries continued on. This blocked many minorities, including Italian, Blacks, Native Americans, from voting onto the two dominant parties' nominees. So theoretically, they could have voted in the general election for their preferred candidate, but they couldn't even vote on who was gonna be in the general election. The breakdown of the Populist Party were also fueled by racism. It was a multi-racial working class movement, but because of the eternal struggles with racism, as many Anglo-Saxons didn't want to be mixed in with Blacks or Native Americans or Irish, the party fell apart. Anti-immigration laws were implemented that resulted in intense racism against minorities. This included the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first and only anti-immigration law that specifically banned a certain ethnic group. The 1920s, the Anti-Mexican Immigration Acts, there was mass deportation, and there was a strong cut to Mexican immigration. And there was anti-Southern and Eastern European immigration laws. They blocked a lot of like Italians, Greeks, Eastern Europeans for going to the United States, because many of the Anglo-Saxons, Americans, they preferred English, French, Swedish, Northern and Central Europe. Official segregation was widely implemented after the fall of the Populist Party, and official segregation only truly broke down into the 1990s. Unofficial segregation has continued since the elimination of legal segregation that was eliminated in paper in the 1960s. So there's still, as you can see in LA, there's still ethnic enclaves where Mexicans tend to be in one place, Central Americans tend to be another place, Blacks tend to be another place, and Asians another section. This isn't just like a tribalism thing. It also includes because there's some areas that cost more than other parts in LA. So a lot of like immigrants that come from Mexico, they have to go with like the Mexican dominated place because rent tends to be lower. While places like Beverly Hills, that tends to be white dominated, whites tend to go there because they tend to have more money. As anti-Asian feelings were boosted by the spread of COVID-19, many blame the actual Chinese citizens and other Asian groups for the spread of COVID instead of the failures of the Chinese and American governments and the World Health Organizations. They were used as scapegoats when they truly didn't do anything, and they were subjected to the same pains that everyone else was. Mass incarceration is overwhelmingly minority based. For example, they tend to be Hispanic, Black, Asian, and they're overrepresentative. Like whites, they make about 60% of the population in the United States, but only about 20 or 30% of prison populations. Systematic racism continues through unequal access to housing, healthcare, democracy. There tends to be less healthcare for Blacks and immigrants. Housing also tends to be more poor. Even in New York, we're supposed to be a liberal bastion. As you can see, there's very poor housing in the area, and the people living there tend to be minority based. There's also been restrictions to voting rights. Many states now require a state ID, like in Texas, and they're very confusing. They're not very direct how to get that state ID and what qualifies. The war on drugs has resulted in mass violence across the country and the border. It's been hurting minority communities ever since. Like a lot of these politicians, a lot of these police officers, they use the excuse of someone possessing marijuana to send them to prison for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. It was a very, very damaging system towards minorities. There's also extensive police abuse. This includes stop and frisk, qualified immunity, and overly violent behaviors, as we all know, George Floyd. But it doesn't just stop there. A lot of people, they could get stopped in the road for no other reason that they were Black or minorities, which is supposed to be a suspect profiling. Anti-immigration policies have also targeted Latinos, Asians, other communities through Democratic and Republican efforts. It's not just Republicans who tend to do anti-immigration policies, also Democrats. Clinton's anti-immigration policy was very prevalent during the 1990s. He was very against undocumented immigrants. He even said that he wanted to stop all illegal aliens from entering the country. There was mass deportations during the Bush and Obama administration. Bush started the process and he made immigration a lot more strict and a lot more hard to live in the United States. But Obama, he deported millions of people and he was called the deporter in chief. The Muslim ban and child separation of the Trump administration was a continued trend of anti-immigration. He didn't allow about, I believe, like 72 Muslim-dominated countries to send any immigrants, even though they were refugees and they had to under international law. And he continued the policy of the Obama administration's child separation, where children of immigrants or migrants or refugees, they were separated from their parents for months to even years long times. Child separation and record low refugee census continue in the Biden administration. He's supposed to be the next FDR and very progressive, but he is continuing the very draconian policies of the Trump and Obama administration. The war on terrorism has racialized Arabs and Muslims, is leading to a rise of Arab and Muslim racism. Back in the 1990s, Muslims were actually considered whites and they weren't as attacked as they are now. But after 9/11 and after the racialization of Muslims and Arabs, they're now considered a different race. And at the peak of this like anti-Muslim behavior, I believe 44 or 45% of Americans weren't comfortable living next to a Muslim neighbor. So, how would you deal with racism today? Like, it doesn't have to be big, but something small. Like me personally, I would just be, it's almost like saying something racist to another individual for no other reason, just because, they just didn't like them. I'd be like, yo, he's not doing anything or she's not doing anything. All she's doing is just walking around here. Like, you don't have to be so attractive. You don't know that person. Like, I get that you having problems of your own, but you shouldn't bash it, send it to other people.
For me personally, I would say like very radically changing the criminal justice system because it's been rooted in anti-Blackness and racism since the beginning of its creation. So I think that would be a big step in reducing racism in the country. And then someone also said raising awareness by posting information statistics on social media. Yeah, that's awesome. Raising awareness can really help spread information to see the reality of what different minorities are experiencing in the country. Okay, now we're gonna move to the next one. But just quickly before, I just wanna mention, obviously, the history of racism is extensive because it has been in our country since the creation of it. So we obviously can't go through every single thing that has happened or event, but I think it's very necessary that we know the foundation of it, just to know how those effects keep on affecting people to this day, and people still experience racism like in every aspect of their life. Okay, so now we're going to talk about sexism. What is sexism? Sexism is prejudices or discrimination based on gender or sex while believing one is superior, which is usually misogyny when you think that men are superior. And then inequality was first developed in the advent of agriculture, and inequality expanded through the development of the superstructure, and it has an extensive history of sexism in the United States since its creation. Next, please. The history of sexism. In colonial and early America, women were denied the ability to own property and have their own money, be employed, have their education, have equal legal rights, vote, be elected, and much more. After the revolution, women were expected to follow the myth of domestication of women, and they were expected to be educated to school the male children. And this was really, you can see the intersections of sexism and classism in here, because a lot of women were put in this role of being a domestic person that had to take care of those children while the husbands went off to work. And the husbands doing that were gaining wealth, and if they wanted to leave their wives, they had no problem because they had wealth. But women were only allowed to be in the home and weren't allowed to be in the workplace, meaning that they weren't allowed that same thing. They weren't allowed to gain wealth and to go out and explore different avenues. And for example, if the husband was abusive, they didn't have that money because of all that unpaid labor that they had been doing. So now they couldn't leave the husband and they had to, be in that same situation. Next one, please. After the rise of the Industrial Revolution, women were expected to work and attend to the needs and desires of children and husbands. Women were denied voting rights till the 19th Amendment. Feminists were beaten, intimidated, and even killed, and denied ability to join unions or gain leadership in the workplace or government. They were identified as social deviants if they pushed for independent thoughts, and they denied to open bank accounts without men. So as you can see, even after they were allowed to work, they still experienced so many types of sexism. For example, they still had to, even if they were working a full-time job, they still needed to take care of the children and their husbands. They were denied voting rights for a long time. And every time they tried to speak up, they were silenced through intimidation and things like that. Next one, please. And sexism today, women face a gender pay gap. Women face subtle but harmful harassments in public, including the workplace. Sometimes it isn't even that subtle, but it's sometimes normalized, the sexism. Like a lot of times men will joke about women and make jokes that are sexist, but they won't be held accountable for them. Women's opinions are looked under a lower standard than men, and women face a more challenging barrier to entering politics. And also women have a less structural power than men. For example, women face a lot of challenges in politics. We can take, for example, women in politics, that often they have to walk this fine line of either being too aggressive or too passive, because if they are too aggressive, they will be told that they are way too emotional, that they won't be able to run the country or whatever they are running. And if they are too passive, they're going to be told that they don't have an iron fist, and they won't be able to also rule the country under such a passive grip. So women really have to walk this fine line in politics and every aspect of their life. Next one, please. Women political ideology tends to be more challenging the establishment, resulting in greater sexism for the political establishment. Women also continue to face high levels of abuse and rape. Nearly half of all women in the military are sexually harassed, and there is little transparency for women abuse in the military. Next one, please. Now, our question that we want is, have you ever faced sexism? Obviously, if you don't want to answer, you don't have to. But I know a lot of people here have faced sexism. For example, me, when I'm, I don't know, walking down the street, a lot of the times I will get catcalled or harassed because of my gender and because of the way I present. So obviously, sexism is very prevalent today. So if anyone wants to speak up or say something in the chat, we can do that. If not, we can just move on. So I'll give us like 30 seconds in the chat. Yes, someone said being catcalled or even being whistled at just for walking. That's very true. A lot of the times, like, I know I've experienced it too, being catcalled, and it really is directed towards women or representing people. And it's something that a lot of the times we just have to, live with. And we have to expect that when we're walking down the street, that we won't be left alone, that people are going to catcall us, that we're going to be whistled at, that we're going to feel in danger. So that's really prevalent in today's society. Okay, I think we can move on to the next one. So the intersection of immigration and classism. Immigrants are often portrayed as welfare queens, lazy, and parasites to the American society. This is a mixture of classism and anti-immigration, as the prejudice of the working class and immigrants is seen through the perception of laziness and parasitic. Contrary to this opinion, immigrants and the working place are incredibly productive and are ashamed of any use of welfare and governmental aid. And I also want to mention with this, a lot of the times we can see this intersection of classism and anti-immigration in the way that immigrants are spoken about in this country. For example, I know a lot of political commenters who are wealthy but are tend to be democratic or liberal say things like, oh, if immigrants weren't here, who would clean your toilets? If immigrants weren't here, who would mow your lawn? And that's really a classist and anti-immigrant thing to say. because you're seeing immigrants as only being able to do menial jobs. Immigrants can do whatever job they please. Immigrants, they're just mind-blowing what we can do. So saying that we can only do menial jobs such as cleaning and mowing lawns and cleaning toilets is so disgusting. Now, managers and owners of businesses consistently abuse their immigrant workers through intimidation tactics of deportations and their own unequal balance of power in the workplace. For example, they will threaten to fire an employee if the worker refuses to take up a dangerous job. Yeah, and we said very prevalent in our classes group. I've never heard the term welfare queen. Yeah, I personally haven't heard it, but I know that it's something that is said to a lot of mostly minorities. Next one, please. Now, the intersection of immigration and racism. Racism is everywhere in the immigrant community, like any other community. For example, darker skinned immigrants face racism from even other immigrants. For example, Mexican immigrants are sometimes prejudiced towards Central American immigrants, and Asian and Latin American immigrants face cross racism. For example, as we saw with the policy during the Trump era, where they had this policy that they had to Central Americans who came looking for immigration opportunities to the US had to remain in Mexico. And a lot of the times when they remained in Mexico, they experienced a lot of racism there too. So anti-immigrant and racist statements don't just happen in this country, but happen outside of this country, and we're often not aware of it. Immigrants are constantly targeted by their racial groups. For example, a lot of Mexicans are called beaners, dirty Mexicans, or other slurs to Chinese and other Asian minorities. And even to them, there are different types of immigrants. Immigrants are treated as subhuman and inferior, less valuable than products or goods. As we can see in this picture, as we can see on the picture on the right-hand side, we can see an immigrant picking fruits, and this really shows the intersection of immigration and racism, because a lot of immigrants are pushed to do these dangerous jobs because the white people and citizens don't want to do them, but immigrants don't really have any other options, so they're pushed towards these dangerous jobs. And since they're immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants, they fear deportation, and this is a tactic used by their employers to keep them in their place, to also remain anti-union. They'll threaten them with being deported if they don't do these dangerous jobs where they're exposed to pesticides and things like that. Next one, please. Immigrant women are facing the same effects of classism and anti-immigration sentiments, but they face the difficulties of womanhood. They are expected to work a full-time job by being a full-time mother with little appreciation. Their opinion is less validated. Sexual harassment by managers and other employees are widespread, which results in fear-based systems where immigrant women are fearful of rejecting the advances of citizens and male managers. For example, recently I saw the study, I'm not sure where, but saying that often immigrant women often face more sexual harassment advances from their male colleagues because they see them, they're immigrant, they think that they'll be silent, that they won't speak up. So a lot of the times immigrant women are silent. We have someone in the chat saying, I wish there was an undocumented workers union. Yes, that would be great, because a lot of these employers are really harassing our people, and it's not okay. Also, work completed by immigrant women are looked down upon and or envied by other workers who are men and citizens. We said unions are starting to unite with immigrants. That is great. Good to hear. And a little bit more about the intersection of immigration and women. Women not only face sexual harassment here when they have jobs and with their managers and stuff, but also when they're taken to detention centers, they face so many acts of sexual harassment and just sexism in general. For example, Haitian women are often very traumatized because of the things they go through in immigration detention centers. Haitian women tend to take be longer in immigration centers and held there, and we can see that intersection also with racism. because it's specifically Haitian people who are spending longer times in immigration detention centers. Also, for example, for trans women are often misgendered in immigration proceedings, or they're taken to male detention centers, which is really harmful to them because they not only invalidate their gender, but they put them in dangerous situations where they can experience transphobia or when they can be sexually harassed by men. Next one, please.
Question and comments.
Okay, yeah, I think it's better now. So does anyone have any questions or comments, or if you want me to go back to any slides that you need more clarification on, it would be cool. We'll wait a little bit. Okay, it seems like so much to cover in just under an hour. Yes, obviously it's a lot of information, but it's really useful, and we're sorry that we kind of had to rush through it to get through it because there's so much information. But if you want to go back and look at the recording, you can do that too, so you can go more into depth and see for yourself at your own pace what the history of all these types of, discriminations are like. And I will drop down the form in the chat. So if you want to go back, obviously, you have to complete the form in order to get the credit for it. So I will leave the form down in the comments. There are a few questions based on the presentation. So if you watch the presentation all the way through, you should be able to do it very shortly. And thank you everyone for being here. Someone said it's sad to see how racism is projected even between minorities when it's solidarity and unity that we need. Yes, that is very true. A lot of the times we see so much racism in our communities, and it's important for us as minorities to also educate our parents on racism and to not be racist towards other communities, because as you said, that's really what we need. We need unity right now, especially in these really divisive times. And thank you if you made it all the way through. We really appreciate you being here, and everyone who's listening to this recording, thank you too. We said it has been a tactic of the elites to divide and conquer for hundreds of years now. Yes, we can see that through the history that we were presented with, the history of sexism, the history of racism, the history of classism. It all kind of connects, as we can see it intersects. Yeah, thank you, Ria. Thank you everyone for being here. And if that is it, Luis, do you have anything else to say?
No, nothing else is it. Just thank you for listening to our presentation. I know it was very substance based and was a lot of information. So you went through it, the entire thing. Thank you very much, and I hope you learned something from it, because there is a lot of change. There's a lot of important and changing things in our country, and we have a bunch of history of inequality and stuff like that. So learning about this is the first step to actually changing our very unequal country.
Yeah, someone said we'll be sending out the worksheet. You can see the worksheet I pasted the link in the comment. So if you go to that link, you can just view the worksheet and then, copy and paste it into your own document and complete it. And thank you everyone for being here once again. We really appreciate your time and your attention. So if you don't have any questions, I think we are done. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your week, a great rest of your day. And I hope that you are practicing self-care and that you are taking care of yourself. Thank you, everyone, so much.